Welcome everyone to this sixth annual conference on the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council on the path for the public finances. This is the sixth year we've had this conference, and hopefully the last before we return to Dublin Castle next year. As ever, the goal of this council is this conference is to step back a bit from the everyday business of looking at the public finances and to think more deeply at long-term issues of the public finances. In the past couple of years, we've looked at low interest rates, we've looked at long-run fiscal sustainability, we've looked at climate change. And this year's topic fits really well, I think, with those topics, because we're going to be focusing on public investment. Now, what's happening in Ireland, what's planned by the Irish government for public investment is quite remarkable. From very low levels of investment following the banking crisis, the government has been steadily ramping up public investment in the last couple of years and is planning essentially to run public investment at around 5% of national income from 2024 onwards. That's a remarkable level of investment to last out over a decade. There are only 2 years in the past 2.5 decades when investment rates were higher, and here we're not just supposed to see it for 1 year, we're supposed to see it for a whole set of years in a row. So this is a really major development, and of course those investments are needed in terms of housing, in terms of climate change, and of course a range of other issues around the public sector. The impact of this, if you take the government's plans from a budgetary perspective, essentially the government is still planning, despite this years, and that's because it's accommodated this rise in investment from a number of different sources, partly lower interest rates, partly discipline on current spending, partly the boom in corporation tax receipts. From a macroeconomic perspective, this investment has been ramped up over the past couple of years. It's one of the things that's helped to sustain the economy during the COVID period, but of course there are big questions about how quickly it will be possible to ramp up investment. And of course, finally, what's really important is value for money. That's obviously important in itself. We obviously want this money to be well used. It's a large amount of money, but also it's important for what it means to the public finances and growth and the economy. In the past, public investment in Ireland has been on a bit of a roller coaster. So perhaps this time we'll be able to have the story will end in a different way. There's a lot to discuss. These are very rich issues. It's great that so many people have been able to join us today, and also that we have such a great list or great set of panelists to discuss these issues. I think we always learn a lot for our own assessment work from these conferences, but I hope you learn a lot from it as well. Today, what we're going to do this afternoon, we've got a 2-hour session, is to focus on national experiences and specific programs of building up public investment. We hope that will inform the way we think about public investment here in Ireland. Tomorrow, we will start by focusing more on governance issues, which are very important from obviously from a value for money perspective. We'll be hearing from international organizations on that. And we'll conclude tomorrow afternoon with a policy panel with a wide range of experts to think through the economic and other budgetary implications of this big build-up in investment. Each of the presentations this afternoon will be about half an hour, or we have a half an hour slot for each speaker. Hopefully we'll have about 20-25 minutes of presentations, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions and perhaps a little bit of discussion. If you can put your questions in the chat, we'll pick them up, and that's probably the most efficient way of managing the sessions. Please follow the event on Twitter. If you want to do that, please use the hashtag PFPF 2022. It's PFPF 2022. We'll be putting the slides on our website afterwards, and I think with that brief introduction, hopefully we're all set for an interesting session. We also take this opportunity to thank everyone who's contributed to preparing this conference and for the participants in advance, but particularly our Chief Economist and Head of Secretariat, Eddie Casey, who's really been the driving force behind this. So thanks very much for joining. Hopefully we've got an interesting 2 hours ahead of us. We're going to start with our very own Niall Conroy. He's an economist on the Council Secretariat, and he's going to take you through the analysis that we did as background for the November-December of last year fiscal assessment report. So Niall, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just share these slides. As Sebastian was saying, this is joint work with Eddie Casey and Elliot Jordan Doak, two members of the Council Secretariat. And it's basically work that tries to look at both the historic experience in Ireland with public investment and also examine the National Development Plan and the planned ramp up in public investment that a lot of this conference is based around. So hopefully this might provide a decent scene setting for what's to come later. So Sebastian actually in his introduction already kind of outlined how public investment in Ireland has been very pro-cyclical in its recent history. So you can see here the blue line here is showing the output gap and the pink line is showing public investment. So you can see here that in periods where the economy appears to be overheating or there's strong demand where the output gap is positive, we tend to see strong public investment taking up a large share of national income. So that's kind of adding to already strong demand in the economy. Whereas in periods of downturns where the output gap is falling or negative, we tend to see a lower level of public investment. So you can see here that the government investment has really been amplifying the cycle and making the swings in the economy even larger than would otherwise be the case. But there's a number of implications of that, and they're not just in terms of the kind of macro economy. That's the obvious one, that obviously this is pro-cyclical. But there are other implications as well. So for example, this sort of pattern of investment is going to deliver pretty poor value for money. So if you're doing a lot of your investment when there's strong demand in the economy, prices are going to tend to be higher, right? So you're going to get, for a set amount of nominal investment, you're going to receive less capital goods in return. So you're going to get worse value for money. On the other hand, if you're investing when the economy is in a downturn, you tend to get better value for money. Prices will tend to be lower. Another kind of almost hidden cost or problem with this sort of investment pattern from the government is around how the construction sector operates. So the construction sector in Ireland has seen large swings in demand, like the economy in general, and that's obviously been problematic, right? So if you have large swings in demand in the construction sector, big cyclical swings, you're going to have a lot of firms go bust in the downturns. So you have a lot of entry and exit of different firms. If you had public investment moving in a more counter-cyclical direction, then there will be kind of more certainty around the level of demand is going to be in the construction sector. And that would aid that sector in a lot of ways. It would really aid productivity, because if you don't have a load of entry and exit and churn of firms, that obviously might support better productivity. It would also give more certainty for the sector to invest in certain capital goods that might enhance their productivity. So while the obvious implication of this sort of pro-cyclical investment from government is obviously in terms of macroeconomic effect, there's also effects on specific sectors like this. This is just it's quite difficult to really compare the size of the public capital stock in different countries. But what we've tried to do here is try and take a reasonable comparison of some selected OECD countries. And we can see that Ireland appears to have a lower or smaller public capital stock compared to a lot of the kind of other OECD countries. And that's using 2018 data. And so that's a little bit about the kind of history, or recent history of investment in the public capital stock. As we said, a lot of what's being talked about today is around these kind of very ambitious plans for public investment in years ahead. So this is kind of giving a historical perspective. So you can see here that public investment has had reasonable swings in the past. You can see that it fell below 3% in the post-financial crisis. so in the kind of early 2010s. It's risen, it's recovered a good bit in the last 3 to 4 years. And then there's another sharp increase in the level of public investment planned over the next few years, getting up to about 5.5% of national income by 2024, and kind of broadly remaining at that level thereafter. So as Sebastian said, this is a very high level of investment for Ireland. Historically, there's only been a couple of years where we've invested at that higher rate, but it's not just that we're planning to invest at that rate for 1 or 2 years. That looks like it's the kind of steady state that's being assumed for a number of years. So a very high level of investment historically for Ireland. This chart is trying to see how this will compare internationally. So we're looking here at OECD countries and what their kind of public investment levels typically are over the last 10 years. So we've highlighted Ireland here. You can see we're, over the last 10 years, just about around 3%, which is a little bit below other OECD countries. Most of them kind of fall in the 3 to 4% range. But what's planned for Ireland is to rise up to 5.5%, as I outlined earlier. And you can see that basically no other OECD country is investing at that high a level over the last 10 years. So not only would 5.5% of national income be a high level of investment for Ireland historically, it would be a very high level internationally. And that's, as I say, that's something that's not just for 1 or 2 years, it's planned for a number of years in the future. And the National Development Plan itself shows a significant ramp up, and it's much more ambitious than previous plans. So something like the National Development Plan of 2018, or even something as recent as the SPU in April last year. The level of investment that's now planned in the most recent National Development Plan is a good bit more ambitious than those we would have seen previously. So this is just summing up what I've said earlier there. So a sharp increase in public investment from what was a low post-financial crisis. And this is a high level, not just historically, but also internationally. So one of the things that people often consider when you see public investment or plans like this is what are the potential economic impacts or economic benefits that one could see. So in the paper, we assess these potential impacts 3 different ways. So you can look at the international literature, of which there is a broad range. You can use production function approaches, and a final approach we take is to use the Council's MAC model. So this is a model that was developed by Eddie Casey and David Perdue, which is used in a lot of Council analysis now of macroeconomic impacts of fiscal policy. And so typically thinking about public investment multipliers, these multipliers, if you look at the literature, broadly tend to be larger than for other types of government spending. So, government consumption, wages, and public investment multipliers tend to be a bit higher. But also the uncertainty around them is really large. So there's a broad range of estimates that you can find for multipliers of public investment. And the reason for that is that there's a large number of factors that are at play here. So go through some of the factors that will influence how big or small these multipliers are going to be. So essentially, like all multipliers, it's a story of crowding out and crowding in effects. So you can think here for public investment, crowding out would be if you have public investment which is replacing private investment that otherwise would have occurred. Crowding in effects would be where, because of the public investment that occurs, more private investment then flows in as a result. So a factor that's going to be important in terms of what the size of the multiplier you might expect here will be timing. So are you investing during an economic boom or during a bust? So like what is typically found in literature for a range of estimates, if you're investing in a time where the economy is quite depressed, where there's low demand, multipliers are typically going to be higher. If you're investing during a time where demand is strong, there's a strong cyclical upturn, your multipliers are obviously going to be lower because you're going to be doing more crowding out there. And I've just talked kind of generically here about public investment or government investment, but the type of investment is going to matter too. So is the investment labor intensive? Is it likely to employ a lot of domestic labor? Are the sectors that you're investing in able to easily accommodate that additional money? Are there capacity constraints? That's going to be another important factor. Another important factor, particularly for Ireland, is going to be size and openness of the economy. So if the economy was large and closed, you're probably going to have bigger multipliers than one that's small and open. That's pretty obvious, right? If you have a small open economy, there's going to probably be more of this investment is going to lead to just bigger imports, and hence there's going to be bigger leakages there. Another factor that could influence the potential multiplier you get will be policy responses. So how does monetary policy respond? So say you have an increase in public investment, and that increased demand then leads to a higher price level. Is monetary policy then going to react and tighten policy in order to counteract that? That could be an issue. It's unlikely to be an issue here, obviously, because I don't think anyone's suggesting the National Development Plan is going to lead to the ECB altering its policy stance. The monetary policy for Ireland is not set by Irish policymakers. And the final factor here that I just outlined is that expectations matter, right? So what are the government debt levels, and how forward-looking are people or economic agents? So this just shows a range of estimates of public investment multipliers. So towards the top here in green, we have studies that examine Ireland specifically, and then below that in kind of pink is studies that are looked at individual other countries or an aggregate of other countries. And essentially all I want to show here is that there's a really broad range, right? So as I said earlier, there's high uncertainty as to what these multipliers are going to be. For the first paper there that was involved with Kate Ivory and Eddie Casey, we actually showed the error bounds. So that's a 95% confidence interval there, and you can see just how wide that is. And also the uncertainty you can see is pretty evident from just how broad the range of estimates that we are showing there. So as I said, there's a range of different estimates of multipliers for Ireland. Another part of the literature examines, are multipliers different depending on what sort of area you're investing in? So for example, a piece of literature that's now becoming more common is to look at green multipliers. So if you're investing in kind of green technologies, what are the likely multipliers there? Because relatively recent literature, there's a small number of studies, but typically they seem to be finding a multiplier of just above 1. Similarly, there's literature looking at what are the multipliers from investing in housing. And again, multipliers seem to be just above 1 there typically. So this kind of, seeing this literature kind of motivated us to think, well, if you look at the National Development Plan, we have estimates there of what the broad sectors are to be invested in and broad amounts. So could you use a kind of a weighted share of these multipliers to reflect the different multipliers that come from each of these different areas? So that's essentially what we're doing here. So we're using the weights in the National Development Plan for these different areas, and then we're applying these long-run assumed multipliers that we've got from the international literature here. So bringing this all together would imply a multiplier of about 1.3 for the areas that are in the National Development Plan. And that's partially because a lot of the National Development Plan is focused in the areas of housing and transport, which typically have somewhat larger multipliers than other sectors. Another approach that one can take is to use a production function. So this would be typical in the literature as well. So there's also going to show here a relative to a counterfactual. So the counterfactual to keep in your head here is, had public investment remained fixed at its 2021 level of national income. So had public investment just stayed at 4.1% of national income right out to 2030, say, what would real output be in 2030 relative to that counterfactual? And using a production function approach for Ireland, we seem to find real output would be about 0.7% higher than otherwise would have been the case had you not had this increase in public investment. So I've summarized a few different approaches one could take there. So this is just trying to summarize a few different estimates you could get of what the boost to real output would be in 2030 due to this increased level of investment that's outlined in the National Development Plan. So I just outlined there the 0.7 for a production function for Ireland. If you use estimates from Cosmos, that's the ESRI's macroeconomic model, that would be about 0.8. If you use the MAC model that the council typically use, it'd be about 0.9. So you're finding estimates here just below 1% perhaps. The outlier is if you use the production function from kind of the international literature, that gives a much larger boost to output, but that's hardly unexpected. The international literature is not taking into account specific factors for Ireland. So what I was saying before about Ireland being a small open economy is going to typically mean these multipliers are going to be a bit lower. So this is just summarizing again that by focusing on housing and transport, that might imply a higher multiplier than would otherwise be the case. It looks like real output might be about 1% higher than would otherwise be the case. There's also going to be higher price level. So about 0.6, we estimate that prices will be about 0.6% higher due to the additional investment. And obviously, there's a risk, right, that these price impacts could be larger, depending on what the economic cycle is like at the time, particularly in sectors like the construction sector. So we're going to have a look at some of the kind of issues there around capacity constraints now. So as I say, the ramp up in public investment that's outlined in the National Development Plan is coming at a time when the economy is forecast to be growing quite strongly. So capacity constraints, particularly in the construction sector, could become quite apparent. If this was to be the case, this would probably mean higher prices, lower real output, poor value for money. You'd get less capital goods for the given amount of nominal investment that you're making. And a key issue that's going to potentially arise in the construction sector is going to be labor supply, right? So there's a big ramp up in construction forecast to happen. Where are the workers going to come from? So previously, we have previous experience of this. In the mid 2000s, there was a big increase in construction activity and construction employment, and that was largely fueled by inward migration. Another channel that you might see increased labour supply would be just to get from people that are previously unemployed. But pre-pandemic, there was limited unemployment in the construction sector. So it's hard to see a massive contribution coming from that channel. So this is just showing an attempted measure of labour productivity in the construction sector. And we can see that productivity has been pretty stagnant over the last 20 to 30 years. in the construction sector. So it's not easy to obviously measure this, but with the best estimates that we could come up with, it looks like productivity is not much higher than was the case in the late 90s, really. Internationally, again, international comparisons are difficult, but with the best estimates that we have, which suggest that Ireland is below average amongst the OECD in terms of construction productivity. So again, that would be something that you'd hope might be improved upon. So I said earlier that migration was key to providing the additional workers in the last big construction increase or expansion. And that was in the early to mid 2000s. And this chart is basically showing the wage differential in the construction sector in Ireland relative to these other countries or group of countries. So the important bar here is the blue bar, which was what we would have called then the new EU accession states. So you can see in the early 2000s, there was a massive premium in Irish wages over the wages in those home countries. And so, wages here were 5 to 6 times larger than was the case in those countries. That differential has shrunk markedly now to only about 2.6. So it might not be as attractive for people from those countries to migrate to Ireland than would have been the case in the early to mid 2000s. So migration might not provide quite the boost that would have happened previously. As I said, there was limited unemployment in the construction sector before the pandemic. So there's not a big pool of unemployed construction workers ready to be put to work to provide this additional activity. So even if you're to restore all unemployed construction workers into employment, you'd still have a shortfall of about 28,000 workers relative to what you'd need for the National Development Plan. There's 3 potential sources, as I say: migration, attracting people who are not in the labour force, so those that are currently inactive, or pulling people in from other sectors that are currently employed. But in all 3 cases, it's likely that this will mean wage pressures, right? Upward wage pressure in the construction sector. And that would be typical historically in Ireland. So you can see here that when unemployment in the construction sector has tended to be low, we tend to see much stronger wage growth in the sector. And that seems likely to occur in the future as well. Okay, so final thing I kind of want to go through here is some of the challenges that arise with public investment. Now, I know some of our other speakers are going to talk about answer this, like Donald is going to speak about cost overruns and some of the drivers of that. But I just want to show again here that how pro-cyclical revisions to public capital spending have been. So you can see in the early years here how public capital spending was reduced over time, over successive plans in order to correct public finances. And here in the latter years, an upward revision to public capital spending when the economy is probably going to be doing quite well. And again, there's obvious political economy reasons why this might be the case, right? So when in an economic downturn, when spending cuts might be required, capital spending is probably easier to cut than current spending. Final thing I really want to look through here is just some recommendations from the IMF in a PIMA report that was published in 2017. So they made a number of different recommendations around public capital spending in Ireland. And I want to just selectively go through a few of the recommendations they made on what has been done since. So the first here is strengthen use and application of cost-benefit analysis. So there has been some improvement on this, but it's not compulsory in the public spending code, as far as I'm aware, that the cost-benefit analysis has to be undertaken. It doesn't appear that this is completely uniform. across the board. Another recommendation here was greater analysis on the cost of maintaining and rehabilitating the existing capital stock. So this is in place for certain sectors, but not comprehensively. So something that I think would be beneficial would be if there was like a comprehensive register of public capital assets, and that would assist with this. And you could also have a that would allow kind of clarity on the maintenance that is required for the stock and the likely costs of that. Around transparency, again, another recommendation here was just around a register of infrastructure assets. So as I was saying previously, essential register of public assets, public capital assets, and the likely maintenance funding required for them. Another recommendation just surrounded improvements around the tracker, the public investment tracker. So the tracker has been updated, but there are other aspects that could still be improved. Like there isn't any information on when there's delays or changes or updates to your capital project that's been planned, and that could be a potential improvement. And then kind of a final suite of recommendations that they made was around kind of learning from the past. So look to encourage the Controller and Auditor General to have performance audits, and to kind of have these systematic reviews of the largest 10 projects that have been completed. So these sort of reviews do sometimes occur, but it seems to be kind of ad hoc. Sometimes they're kind of slim on detail. I think what might be helpful is if there was kind of a more systematic approach to learning from the past and kind of backward-looking critical assessments of how public investment has been completed, and that might assist kind of learnings for the future. Okay, so just summing up, public investment in Ireland has been largely pro-cyclical. The stock looks low compared to OECD peers, albeit comparisons are tricky. The National Development Plan is seeking to increase public investment to very high levels, both historically and internationally. This could yield significant economic benefits, but capacity constraints and price pressures, could be significant. A key issue is going to surround labour supply in the construction sector. And given that we're going to see a large increase in public investment in the coming years, any improvements in processes, value for money, those would be key and could be really valuable and deliver a much better outcome. Okay, that's all I have. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take any questions we might have from the floor.
Thanks for that, Niall. Fantastic overview of what's happening now, what's happened in the past, and what may happen in the future on public investment.